Well, first I'll give a brief outline of the building of reservoirs in England and Wales from a little research I've done. And then I shall use a single example to illustrate some of the tasks undertaken by landscape architects in that context. Now, the first big reservoir in England and Wales was Lake Fernway, which is pictured here. And it was designed by Thomas Hawksley, the engineer Thomas Hawksley. I'll make sure I can make this work. Dams, of course, are an important part of reservoirs, and structurally the important part. And there are basically two sorts of dams. Either a built one, nowadays would be concrete or stone, like Lake Fernway, and this is a concrete construction, which was one of Sylvia Crowe's reservoirs, and you can see her top right, during the construction, working on site. And I do think, with reservoirs anyhow, working on site is a very important part of the work of the landscape architect. She, in fact, designed 7 reservoirs. And this is an earth dam, which is vegetated on the surface, so it's a very different sort of construction. The engineer here was Cuthbertson and Partners. And a rather interesting thing happened with this project. There was a BBC design competition in the 1980s, and it was won by this reservoir as the best, the public voted, the best designed object in the United Kingdom at that period. And this so annoyed the architectural profession that landscape works were next year excluded from the competition. Now, a very brief story of the water industry. In 1945, which is really the beginning of our subject for today, there were over 1,000 different bodies involved in water supply. Local authorities mainly, and in 1945 a Water Act was brought in which gave statutory powers for supply and construction. And then in 1963 the Water Resources Act was brought in, and this set up 27 river authorities and Water Resources Board. And then in 1973 another Water Act which introduced a national framework of 10 water authorities, which you can see on the plan their shapes, and in 1989 water authorities were privatised. Now I have done a diagram, which is on the left here, of the construction of reservoirs from Lake Fernway, which is the one right at the top, going through time until privatisation. And you can see that gradually more and more volume of water was impounded during the period, so that I put the figures up there, so that each period between the acts a greater impoundment took place. And doing this diagram, and I had no idea that this would come out, I'm completely furious that since 1990 not one large reservoir has been built. And I thought to myself, perhaps there was so much supplied before they didn't need any more. But I live in the Thames Water area, and they have a plan for a new reservoir, which was put forward 12 years ago. It's a very controversial site, which my practice helped to choose, and may be refused planning permission, but they haven't bothered even to make a planning application. So the Thames is going to run short of water. And I'd just like to read you a little bit about this water authority. It is now owned, Thames Water is now owned by the following groups: Canadian Pensions, the BT, that's the one British company, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, the China Investment Corporation, and the Kuwait Investment Authority. And in March 2017, their other duty, which is looking after sewage, they were imposed a record fine of £20 million for putting untreated sewage to a total of 1.4 billion litres into the rivers of Thames Water. So I have to say that I think privatisation of water is a complete failure. And I was so angry when I made this, but I thought I'd just touch on that. Now this is the Cuba Reservoir. I'll just perhaps go back. Just here is a very, very big reservoir, and that's the Cuba Reservoir, which was actually, it contains a fifth of the water which was impounded in that period. Designed by Babty Shaw and Morton, the engineers, and the thing about it is that water could become a very valuable export. There are lots of places in the world which are going to run out of water, and Kielder is bigger, I think, than the needs for that area, because it was built to serve a very big industrial need, which is, I'm sorry to say, died away. And there are big pipes down to the quays, so the water could be exported. And this valuable asset has been sold, in this case, to a Chinese company, or given, I think, really. So that's the biggest of the reservoirs. On the left is a small reservoir, that's less than the 10 million cubic metres of the bigger reservoirs. The engineers were Hill and Son, but the important thing about this reservoir is that a landscape scheme was required as a condition of planning consent in 1960. So this was part of this process of landscape becoming more and more important. It was written up in landscape design, a little bit of advertising for Merle and the archive. You can look at all these things in the old magazines. That's where I look for them. So they're very useful, these old magazines and other documents. So this reservoir got a Civic Trust Award in 1969 as an outstanding contribution to the surrounding scene, and great care was taken with the landscape as a result of having this planning condition. Our reservoirs have many different shapes. We've already seen this extremely interesting scheme on the left, where the making of the reservoir was combined with the making of a motorway, which seemed a brilliant idea. And you can see the varieties of shape you can get in the water bodies, with the blue one on the right being very complex and very shallow. So that has rather a lot of difficulties with drawdown. I think you will understand that when the water is used, it's drawn down and you get exposed banks. And in this case, you get very long exposed banks. But actually, Sylvia Crowe, with an ecologist, did some work on whether you can get vegetation to go down with the slowly falling water, so you get a green effect on the banks. This is a different sort of reservoir. It's a bunded reservoir by Brenda Colvin, and it's got at one edge against the hillside, which is the bit on this side, and by the time this was being done, Brenda was pretty fierce, as has been mentioned already. She began to change the shape of the reservoir, and in order to save that yew tree and the cedar tree, which is just showing on the left, she made them change the shape of the hillside bank of the reservoir. And then you can see on the right, it's a concrete lined reservoir, and she put a sort of inset at the top so that stones could be added in the top to make a better edging, as you can see in the picture on the left. So the landscape architect by this time is really influencing the way the reservoir is handled. And here, the Bund, you can see on the right, the Bund was actually modified in shape by adding soil so that trees could be added. And in the photograph on the top on the left, you can see trees added onto the Bund. So the landscape architect begins to be able to change the shape of the reservoir itself. I mean, well, the bunding, and if it's an earth dam, the earth dam, so that it can be treated in a landscape sort of way. I'm going to have a very brief interlude here onto pump storage reservoirs, which are going to be very relevant, it seems to me, for the future, because things like wind, or wind in particular, more than sun, stops sometimes in cold winter weather, so you need a big battery. And a pumped storage reservoir is a big battery for storing energy. When there's plenty of spare energy, say at night, the water gets pumped up to the top reservoir, and then when energy is needed, it's released through the power station, which is there in fact, and goes into the bottom reservoir. And you can see you get sudden peaks, and if you haven't got some system like that, you have to have a power station idling all the time so it can suddenly produce energy. But if you've got a pumped storage reservoir, it can produce energy in about 3 seconds. So if there's a demand, you can simply turn it on. But in landscape terms, it has disadvantages. It has an unnatural margin. The two reservoirs have unnatural margins which are exposed for different times, and they're less good for recreation, particularly the bottom one, because of the water suddenly pouring out with great force. So we have a problem to think about as a profession. What do you do with pumped storage reservoirs? Because they're obviously very important technically. We did have to design one in the Peak District. It wasn't exactly the best site. When I went to the engineer's office, I saw on the wall a big map of England and Wales with marked all the places where you could put pumped storage reservoirs. They were all in beauty spots where people had been on holiday. So I did a little bit of looking at less beautiful places and found there are quite a lot of places with big changes of level between the top and the bottom where you could put such reservoirs. Now in this case, the red lines on the left show our proposal for the roadway, and that was adopted by the engineers. All the other lines are possible lines which didn't seem so good, in particular the ones on the right, which are very close to the Pennine Way, which you can see in the picture on the right, which I won't go into, but it's obviously a wonderful asset. But you can see also the top reservoir itself is moved sideways, and we recommended it should be moved sideways and put lower so that it couldn't be seen from within the Peak District. And those little drawings on the right show the effect of the reservoir as proposed standing up on top of the ridge, whereas if it was moved sideways, if you can imagine on the top drawing, it would be the same sort of level as the natural silhouette, and you could design the silhouette such that it does seem to be an extension of the natural silhouette. However, this scheme was not built, well, partly because we refused to support it, but I think really because it sort of fell out of fashion at the time because nuclear power was declining a bit. But I'm sure that this will come into use again. And so by, excuse me, by 1989, when Rodeford was commissioned, which was the last reservoir, big reservoir to be built, the landscape consultant was a central member of the design team. And in fact, in the case of Rodeford, first there was a public hearing into a proposal to put a reservoir in the middle of Dartmoor, which Gibbard, as the landscape architect, said he thought was a very bad idea, but if it had to be done, he'd design it. And then Sylvia Crowe looked at 27 possible sites for reservoirs in the valleys north of the Dartmoor, and Rodeford was chosen. We were fortunate enough to be the consultants. And what you can see here is that the landscape architect really is designing the whole of the edge of the lake. And this is a particularly interesting part of this reservoir. This road bridge was sited in a position because there was a farm called Seckham Farm, which the arm of the reservoir divided into two parts. The good farmlands on high land there. The valleys are usually poor farmland with rough woodland. And so we advised that the road should be put there, rather more expensive than going around the edge of the water, so that second farm would be joined up again. It's been farmed by the same family for 900 years. And we also recommended a sagging profile so that the bridge was less dominant in the landform. So we thought a straight road would somehow be too dominant. Whether that's right or not, it shows that by this time landscape architects were able to influence all sorts of parts of reservoir design. So I'm now going to look at Brenda Reservoir in North Wales to give some examples of what actually happens during a job. Well, the first thing that's really important about this reservoir is that it is part of a total river management scheme. The first reservoir I showed you, Vernwy, takes the water from the river and puts it down a pipe to, I think, Liverpool in that case, thus damaging the river. This scheme works in exactly the opposite way. It is part of 4 reservoirs supplying the River Dee, all of which can be fed into the River Dee, and the water is taken out up there. I think there's another place taking it out there. So that the reservoir flows contribute to the flows in the river, and this is a very essential part of the scheme. And a particularly nice feature of this is that Brenda Reservoir is very slow to fill, so it was a sort of reserve reservoir, but it meant that this reservoir here, Llyn could be used to actually control the water in this river for canoeing, whitewater canoeing. And water could be released according to the standards of the canoers. So very high standard canoers could have really large quantities of water thundering down here, and sort of ordinary canoers like you see in the pictures would have less water, but they could all enjoy it. So this system of working the reservoirs and the river together became a very important part of reservoir design. And in this case also, Dr. Cran was our client. He was the civil engineer for Dunkelin, which drowned a Welsh village, and he was horrified. And so Brenda Reservoir is high on the moorland with no inhabited houses being removed. So the first thing which landscape architects can now, or could then, contribute was land use planning on quite a big scale. And in fact, this was referred to by the Prince of Wales in his maiden speech, which I'll quote a little bit of. Your Lordships may be intrigued to discover that the submission in 1971 of a landscape report for the Brenda Reservoir scheme in Mynach Harathod marked one of the first occasions in the history of reservoir construction that recreation potential had been written into the primary plan. And this was a great step forward. I don't know whether it really was the first, but it shows that the landscape architects were becoming involved from the very beginning. And in this scheme, recreation with cars is on the west, on this side. The northern part of the reservoir is for nature conservation, and in this case there was archaeology discovered as well. And the eastern bank was for people who wanted to get away into secluded and sort of separate recreation. So the whole place was laid out for recreation. And you can see in the little plan top right, the edge of the forest, it's commercial forestry, was reshaped so that the moorland and the forestry and the water combine in a satisfactory manner. And rather pleasingly, on that moorland, just when it was scheduled as a nature reserve, some hen harriers moved in. and nested. So as we move down the west bank, you have recreation with boats, and it's rather a cold reservoir, but Dr. Cran was a very amusing person. He said, we can't have people swimming here if we're going to get sued if someone gets drowned. So we'll put up notice everywhere saying no swimming. But he told his staff never to stop anyone swimming. And you can see that each of the places where people could drive their cars and stop by a picnic table and so on, some of them were further back from the water, so that views were opened out and so on, and it was created. And the gradient into the lake was very gentle here, so it's safe for children. They can paddle in and aren't going to suddenly fall into deep water. So then there's the incidental things. I mentioned nature conservation, which was very important in the northern part of the lake, but also this interesting thing here of restoring the archaeology. There was total destruction of the archaeological remains in order to find out what they were by the archaeologists, but they recorded very carefully what they found. So we reconstructed the archaeology for visitors. It's actually quite tough. There's, I'm afraid, a bit of cement inside underneath the stone so that it sticks, so that people can walk about on it. But it's a kind of, in a way, it's a bit Disney-esque, I suppose, but people enjoy going there, and they can have explained a large number of different archaeological features from ancient times and had them interpreted. Then we have the people who actually live and work in this landscape. Dr. Cran, there were 4 big farmers who had big losses. Dr. Cran brought he never came to it, he brought got an MP to bring a bill into Parliament for full compensation of 4 farmers. And normally they were compensated according to their incomes. If they were not landowners, they were tenants. And their incomes were remarkably small because they didn't like paying tax. So he said they must be compensated as if they were landowners, which happened, because the precedent of having it actually go through Parliament was not liked by the ministry. So they all got proper compensation. But there were 2 farmers left in the south who were going to get land back. And this plan, well, you can see the land there, which is being handed back. This plan shows with the darker yellow the better land, and that's the land which is being handed back to these 2 farmers. And they had not talked, their families had not talked to each other since the 1920s, because this piece of land, which was farmed by this farmer, was just by the house of that farmer. And I don't know how it came about, but there was very ill feeling between them. So we had a very interesting meeting in Welsh. I don't speak Welsh. The 2 farmers were in different rooms. The National Farmers Union for Wales, Welsh speaking, was going up and down the passage carrying messages, and we had agreed in the long afternoon how to hand the land out again. And the farmers were happy to agree the redistribution because this piece of land was handed back to that farmer, who was this farmer was very astute, and he organised that the temporary caravan site, the people who worked on site, should be on his land, about here, and it should have really good facilities, like electricity, proper sewage and so on, all of which has now been turned into a nice caravan site. And you can see also in the photograph, there's a little pond which you might see on the far right. That was a result of land slippage. That's actually the spoil tip from soil that was taken from underneath the dam. And this is the importance, I think, of being on site, because the slippage made this very nice feature with good nature conservation value, and we immediately said, well, keep it, we'll change the shape of the spoil tip. the engineers were Bingham partners. The dam itself is constructed with a waterproof core, which you can see there, which is made of clay, and it's a very subtle construction with different densities of sand and then finally rock from the inside to the outside, so that the little bits of the particles of the ground are not moved outwards all the way through. At the same time, we played a role in slightly reshaping the face of the dam. You can see the dashed line is the engineering face, and the dark line is the face as built. And also, because it was a very long dam, a kilometre long, we recommended they put a hill in the middle with trees on it, which is what they did. And then came the surfacing of the face of the dam. I thought that for a kilometre long dam, just a grass surface would be very dreary. So we had some parts where there was exposed stone. It was made out of stone on the outside, and some parts with moorland grasses on them. And to get some texture into the exposed stone, we wanted to put rocks, sort of 10-ton rocks, which you can see top right. But when we started having them pushed over from the berm, which you can see at the very top, they didn't roll down as I thought they would, and they just stuck at the top. But a very cunning driver of a crane said he could manage that, and everyone was to go away. He used his crane as a discus, and he swirled around like that, and the rocks went shooting out, and they landed, you see, in all sorts of different places. It worked extremely well. And that's another pleasure of working on site, that actually the people who drive these immense machines can do the most delicate things. We had our woodland areas cultivated by a huge machine, sort of about sort of 2 or 3 centimetres of subtlety was what we demanded, and they did it perfectly well. So you see here the long dam with the hill in the middle. It isn't in the middle, but sort of towards the centre, to break it up into 2 parts. And you've got the drawing below, which was the design, and you can see it's slightly different, in fact. The wooded hill is slightly wider and larger, but the general idea was followed. And then on the left you can see the engineering work at the outlet works completed, and it's ready for the living layer to be placed. And there it is. And I think one thing that's terribly important is the relationship with the other consultants, in particular civil engineers. We had a wonderful relationship with the civil engineers, and particularly with the resident engineer, who of course were responsible for everything that happens in legal terms. So we were his advisor. We couldn't go and say to anyone, do something, because he was legally responsible. So it was very important to have this nice relationship. And I think you can see 2 things here which are particularly amusing about our relationship. The first is we made them look after the trees extremely carefully. I think I might just go back and no, you probably can't see it. There was a tiny little hawthorn tree which we had them keep right on the side of the dam and root pruned it to keep it. And we were very particular about no damage being done. And the scheme here was that if they didn't pollute the river, they got the contractor, they got £2,000 a day paid. And we managed to get the landscape works included in that. And on one day someone walked into a protected area and tread on a bluebell. Cost £2,000. But anyhow, as a joke against me, with a big machine, they planted these 2 trees, which thrived, of course. And that was just done by the engineers. The other thing was that we wanted to put a pool at the bottom of the dam in this area. for nature conservation and ornamental purposes, and the engineers started saying it'd be very dangerous, it wouldn't work at all, and so on, which was all nonsense, obviously. But we realised it was an aesthetic thing, because they felt that the dam would look as if it was leaking. Now that seemed to us a very good reason, and for that reason you could see there is no pool at the bottom of the dam. Thank you very much.